Hello, Richard.
Hi, Elisa. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good.
So, how does it feel to be back at the Miami Book Fair with a new collection of poems?
It's always wonderful to be here with or without a book, but especially with a book.
Yeah.
It gives you another sense of purpose rather than just hanging out with the authors and gossiping. No, it's really wonderful. Especially this book in particular is very important to me. So, and Miami is so much home to me as well. So it's like always a homecoming for the book.
Right. And this one in particular, I think, when I read the opening, or what I'm calling the prefatory poem, Declaration of Interdependence, well, I was just really stunned with it. It's, we are all this. We are bread and grit and the living and the dead and joyful and bruised. We are each other. I know that a lot of the poems in this collection were written over some time, but I was wondering about the genesis of this one in particular, because you did use it this way.
It's very interesting. There's a few poems that have a similar genesis. One before Trump was elected, I suspected that he was going to be elected just because of the pendulum swing that is always a democracy, right? But I set myself off. I set myself the assignment of writing an inaugural poem for President Trump just to see what would happen.
That's great.
And then I couldn't because there was just no way to skin the cat, so to speak. And then it generated it got me like poetry does. It got me to start thinking deeper than just what is the surface issue, right?
Right.
And it started me in a journey of thinking about this collective we and what is a democracy. So that poem, again, as many poems are there, they're trying to get back to the language of our ideals of our founding fathers and trying to sort of recontextualize it in today's age, and it's really fascinating. I mean, just studying the Declaration of Independence and looking at how we could literally write that to Congress right now and still demand some of the same things from our own government. And thinking about the next level in the Buddhist sense of between independence, but really interdependence is really the way we should all be getting along, right? The idea that we understand that we all need each other and we're really interdependent on each other for happiness, pursuit of happiness, and all the rest.
Right. You have an epigraph, the epigraph from Whitman in Song of Myself. And I feel like a lot of the poems are very Whitman-esque, but I also felt, especially some of the beginning ones, that they're kind of Frost-like also. Election Year and Dreaming a Wall, which remind me a little bit of Mending Wall.
Right. Also, that was part of the instrument. I looked to that poem to see how do I recontextualize that poem,
right. And Frost is, for me, so deceptively metaphorical.
Yeah.
A lot of times people don't even realize that he's being metaphorical, that the whole poem is like that. Of course, the speaker here is much different. This is a speaker who hates his neighbor's flowers. And I guess I was just wondering, did you have someone in mind when you wrote this, or was this?
Yeah, that was another Trump inauguration film that went somewhere else. But what was interesting in that choice, first the poem was going to be called "How to Build a Wall," and bringing in my engineering background, like sort of an instruction poem, and it was directed toward the reader, and then I didn't want to direct it to Trump either, because I wanted again to get sort of the nuances of what is a wall, like the Robert Frost poem, and realizing that we all have the capacity to build walls, right? And it's not always at this level of a presidency or whatnot, or the actual wall, but really that it comes from a psychology that we can all sort of have that wall inside of a wall that keeps us from ourselves, but also a wall that shields us from other people, from making real human connections. We get stuck in our worlds, and so I wanted that poem to reach a little deeper into that kind of psychology or behavior that we're all in a way can be guilty of at different times. So that's why he's symbolic of any person like that, any neighbor like that, and sometimes I think readers see themselves as that person as well. Right?
Well, that's what it suggested that to me too. It's not just this person, but it seems to speak to all the people that feel feel that way. So that was very powerful. There's so much beautiful language in this book, imagery, metaphor, often heartbreakingly so. I'm thinking of your poem, Leaving in the Rain, Limerick, Ireland.
Yeah.
The speaker is traveling by train, and across the aisle is a woman who could be his mother, and she's knitting. And I was wondering if you would mind reading a couple of stanzas.
Sure.
Here,
Sure. It's not one I don't usually read this. It's just a longer poem, but I think I'll be fine without my cheaters here. Beside her, a beard. From here on?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Beside her, a bearded man sleeps. His furrowed brow and bony hands tell a story like the broken spine of the book face down on his lap, parted to words he couldn't finish. Too droll or terrifying for him, perhaps. I wonder if his eyes are green as ferns or brown as dirt, if they're dreaming of tigers or moonlight echoes or the timbre of his father's voice. I wonder if he's leaving home or returning. Maybe he's a stranger like me, among strangers between points on the earth to which these tracks are nailed. Where am I? Where am I going? It doesn't matter. What matters is the poem in the window. A blurred watercolor where tree is chimney, chimney is cloud, cloud is brick, brick is puddle, puddle is rain, and rain is me, refracted in each luscious bead. How free and impossible to be everything, inside everything I see. How terribly beautiful. Never having to say I'm from here or there, never recalling my childhood home where I played checkers alone, or the royal palms lining the street where I learned to ride my bike, or my mango-scented backyard catching fireflies like stars in glass jars, or my bedroom where I first heard my voice say, Richard, my name breaking me from the world suddenly broken into geography, history, weather, language, war.
Wow.
Thank you for that, because I don't, sometimes poems you don't read out loud too often. Like,
Right.
It just takes on a different,
Well,
it
this
took me right back there.
And it just carries you. What matters is the poem in the window. That I just kept coming back to that line. What matters is the poem in the window. It was like, the poems are the window in a way, and I feel like that's what a lot of the poems in this book are, in the way they refract into, these different geography, history, weather, language, war.
I like that. That's a great. That's a great. Yeah. And different people, different histories, different.
Right.
Different issues.
Right. Do you think that poets have, a role in these fraught times to be that window that,
Yeah, I mean, I think this book is a book that I never thought I'd write, just because it's really stretches my comfort zone. I mean, about palm trees and Cuban and pastelitos,
Right.
And I kind of knew that how to write.
And there's a little, but
there's a little bit, because you always come back to that. That's the that's your core, your foundation. But it actually, the whole book in a way is an outgrowth of, or the genesis of the book in a way is being thrust happily so into this public role as presidential inaugural poet. That made me realize. Made me think, what is the civic role of poetry in America? Is there one outside of, I mean, I know there's a tradition, especially among the spoken word artists and all this, but where are the page poets on this, right? And then, where's the we? Or there's so much I poetry, but where's the we poetry? And so, I mean, I wanted the book to be a balance of that. And so, and also digging back into our Latin American roots and Caribbean roots, where the poet and poetry just takes on this, has this other presence. They're like royalty, like they get arrested.
Much bigger than in the United States.
Right. It's always been part of the folklore, more part of a political, and not because they're political poems, but because they become political figures themselves, right? So I think also that was in me too, like the sense of that kind of poetry that we grew up with, like Jose Marti, and I was like a poet who's the psychological liberator of Cuba from colonialism, and like he's a poet, he's also an essay, brilliant writer all around. So just starting to think about in the times like these, to quote one of Adrian Rich's poems. I mean, we have had periods in America.
Mm.
We've had Harlem Renaissance. We had obviously,
Right.
you know, the poets like
even the beat poets.
The beat poets,
or,
right?
Yeah.
And it comes and goes.
Mm-hmm.
And now I think we're in another wave where it's. I mean, I'm seeing like Jane Hirschfield write poems about ecology and like.
Right.
You know, what's going on? I mean, I love it.
Right.
But I think it's just a natural progression of
Mm-hmm.
Poets are always responding to their time, but also adding something that isn't, as I always say, it isn't. And I didn't want this book to just be like beating the same drum. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I wanted it to open up another diet to let us see things that we're perhaps not seeing. To let it open up another dimension, to look at the gray space, right?
Mm-hmm.
Both for myself, I think, and also for the reader. Like, I always half joke that the book is also a question mark. It's like, how to love a country? Well, what's going on?
How do we love this country?
Or what is a country?
Right.
Ultimately, the book at the end is really sort of deconstructing what a country even means in the 21st century. This sort of outdated idea of a nation state with neat little borders that are trading. You know, we're increasingly becoming a global people in so many different ways, and we're seeing knee-jerk reactions to that connection that we're seeing not just here but across the world.
Yeah, definitely.
Like holding back that narrative. No, we're this. We're not that. You know.
Right now, and it's rise of nationalism.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's kind of, as I like to say, it's kind of expected. I mean, and I know we're surprised, but every generation is like, it was the best of times, it was the worst. 68 wasn't a very good year from what I can remember. You know, so we're in another 1968, so to speak.
That's true. Richard, it seems like you have taken on sort of the mantle of your civic role in a way that no other inaugural poet has. I'm sure you feel that.
Yeah.
You know, it's been what, six years,
It'll
almost
be
7.
7 years.
It'll be 7 years in January. So, can you talk about that a little bit? Because it's clear in this book. I mean, you had the biggest audience that a poet could possibly have.
Yeah. And
we were actually talking earlier about, you know, all the other poets. Well, of course, Frost is gone, and Maya Angelou.
And Maya was already Maya Angelou.
And she was already, exactly. The others, most people, you know, didn't know or didn't hear so much. But they didn't continue in the way that you really have. I mean, I feel like this book feels like the book of a national poet to me, you know, and you've just have this, you've really taken it on in an amazing way.
Yeah, it's again, it was also so serendipitous. I mean, I had just finished, I think, my 4th book, and I wasn't sure what I was going to write. The idea of place, home, identity, belonging has always been, you know, my obsession, my core. And I thought, well, I don't really know what's next, and it sort of fell into place, both in the writing, but also in the experience of that. There's many pieces of that. I went to the inauguration like most poets would, like, I'm going to read a poem, come back home, and start walking the dog. Like, I'm a poet. Like, Mark, my partner, was like, do you know what a big deal this is? And so, and it was the process of that, the responses from people. I mean, tens of thousands of emails, people after the inauguration crying in my arms saying, like, I didn't feel part of this country to that moment.
And chills right now.
and I just realized how absent, and also when I think about my own working class background, how I didn't have access to poetry, much less access to accessible poetry. And so I just, it was a self-imposed mission to just call myself a poet evangelist. And also
in a really good way.
and also, not only like for poetry itself, but also the messages of the poetry, and just for people to see what poetry can do. But also, luckily, because it's such a public moment, 1 million people are in front of you, and then another 40 million on TV. I've been invited to the strangest, most wonderful places, like to read at the FDIC. So I'm like, can you pay me in that gold bar? You know, the USDA, the Silicon Valley, how can I have fragrance awards in New York and Lincoln Center. Some of those poems were commissioned poems. Like, so I'm like, the weirder the venue, the more, because for most of these people, it's probably the first time they've even seen a poet, much less been to a poetry reading, much even heard of a contemporary, accessible
Right.
poem in
Right.
language that they understand.
Right.
And they're always ingrained to think, right? I mean, so a lot of people would write me and they're like, we really loved your speech. Because they were so ingrained to believe that they would never understand the poem. That surely
Right.
it must have been a speech.
Right.
And that's what keeps me going. I mean, I travel about 70% of my time, and that's kind of what keeps me going, is just that sense of mission.
Mm-hmm.
And then I've also gotten involved in education, which I think I realized also was
You're
the
the
missing
ambassador
link.
now,
Yeah.
the American Poets.
For the Academy of American Poets.
Right.
And it's mostly working with teachers to try and let
Mm-hmm.
them have their moment with poetry, especially the teachers are, that will confess their, English teachers that confess, we don't get poetry.
Right.
It's to help them have their moment that they never had, that hopefully, and give them different kinds of resources and just letting them look at it.
Teachers do that. The students are going to get that.
Because we can go visit a school, but what about the next class and the next class and the next class? So it was more like that idea of, give a man a fish versus teaching him how to fish.
Absolutely.
And I thought and the Academy has gotten that. They've been serving educators for decades. It's part of their mission. But they've really ramped that up now. And I think you see it in many places. Miami here is doing, they're doing things with teachers, and we're realizing that's a way of perpetuating the art, because at the end of the day, we have to open a territory for poets. So yeah, and that gives me a great sense of mission. And also, not for poetry itself, but for my fellow poets. I mean, I want people to read more poetry so that we can all make a living.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, my kids have, taken creative writing and continue to take creative writing and poetry, and I'm like so glad for that. They don't want me necessarily to look at what they're doing. But I remember doing a presentation years ago at an elementary school. They were having a whole arts day, which was fabulous. And the classes that the teachers were doing poetry, the kids were completely different than the other classes. The kids were just, they were alive, and they were just, it's incredible what it does for you. I think the arts in general just all need to be elevated.
And it's like I always say, it's not that we want to make the kids poets. It's just getting them to understand that way of thinking, which in the end, humanities, arts in general, would then just make you, really is teach you a kind of empathy for yourself, for others, for the world. And ultimately, that's going to be a better doctor, lawyer, engineer, nurse, teacher, you name it.
Right.
And we know that that's what makes horrible doctors. It's about that lack of empathy, that not understanding how to place yourself in another psychology, right?
And the kids understand that more. I know kids take drama and like I said, creative writing and dance. And they're not necessarily that they want to do that. They know that this is just good for them right now.
It's kind of like math.
Right.
You got to learn how to add and subtract in life. Like this is part of what. Because people are always like, "Was poetry relevant?" I'm like, well, I think it's one of the most practical things in the world, to be a better human being. I think that's pretty practical.
Absolutely, absolutely. So. I mentioned to someone at the book fair yesterday that I'd been writing about violence and children at the border, and they said to me, how can we not write those things? And you have, your One Pulse, One Poem. You have the Remembering Boston Strong and the 17 Funerals. All of these come to mind, and these current events, if you will, really test our assumptions, I think, about, and love even for this country. And I feel like that's something that you are addressing, really, really well. It's like our relationship with the country. It's a relationship, which is not always all roses.
Right.
I feel like you're really addressing that here. I was thinking that maybe kind of related to that, we could maybe finish with reading the last couple of stanzas of What I Know of Country.
Oh, sure.
Which was written for the inauguration, also.
Obama's inauguration.
Obama's inauguration, right. But not used, because they asked you to write three poems. I can't even imagine writing one, and they asked you to write three. And you have two of them in here? No, just
all
the
three,
one.
The two that weren't,
Right,
the ones in a separate chapter.
Right. So I thought we would have you read
And that poem was exactly sort of analogous, or kind of the metaphor. That was the first one I wrote, and it was, I've always sort of thought, so it's more of an idea poem. And the idea came first, kind of thing. But I've always thought of my relationship with my country like a romantic relationship.
Right.
And the phases we go through from, which is the beginning of the poem, really, like infatuation and this innocence, like when you're a little kid, and then suddenly reading Howard Zinn, and then realizing the atrocities, and then okay, well, what do we do with that? So it just it's sort of like you realize it's like the equivalent, I imagine, being cheated on, right? You feel cheated, then you forgive, and eventually you come to a mature love, which is about working this out,
Right. Then this feels like a response to that. This is what we do.
Yeah.
So this is what I know of country. I'm just going to have you read the last couple of stanzas. So if you want to start there.
So it says, I stayed, you stayed. We stayed for our boys and girls returning as heroes, some without legs or arms, for our Challenger and towers fainting from the sky, for the terrified lives of the Big Easy stranded like flightless birds on roofs, for the sea that drowned our north, but we swept each grain of sand back to shore, for the candles we lit for our 20 children of Sandy Hook, feeling what we've always felt. To know a country takes all we know of love. Some days better than others, but never easy. To keep our promise every morning of every year, of every century, and wake up, stumble downstairs with our raging hope, sit down at the kitchen table again, still blurry-eyed, still tired, and say, listen, we need to talk.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Thanks.
Thanks.